Part 1. The Arrival. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desolate countryside, I found myself standing at the edge of the winding path that led to my grandmother's secluded cottage. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the distant cry of a lone owl and the rustle of leaves stirred by an unseen breeze. Despite the fading light and the encroaching darkness, I felt compelled to continue forward, drawn inexorably towards the looming silhouette of the house that had been both refuge and prison throughout my childhood. Each step I took seemed to echo through the surrounding woods, a solemn reminder of my solitude in this remote corner of the world. The path twisted and turned, disappearing into the encroaching shadows, as though leading me deeper into a realm untouched by the passage of time. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, beckoning me towards an unknown fate. As I approached the weathered doorstep of my grandmother's cottage, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy shroud. The once familiar sight of the quaint wooden structure now filled me with a deep sense of foreboding, its windows dark and lifeless, its walls seemingly imbued with the weight of centuries-old secrets. The door stood slightly ajar, creaking ominously in the dying light, as though inviting me into a realm of darkness from which there would be no escape. Hesitantly, I crossed the threshold, stepping into the dimly lit interior of the cottage. The air was thick with a scent of decay, mingling with a musty odor of neglect. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock my presence. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing echoing through the empty halls. With each passing moment, the sense of dread that gripped me tightened its icy grip, squeezing the air from my lungs and sending a chill down my spine. Memories flooded back, memories of long-forgotten nights spent in the embrace of my grandmother's love, now tainted by the darkness that lurked within these walls. I could almost hear her voice, whispering from the shadows, beckoning me towards a fate too terrible to comprehend. As I ventured deeper into the bowels of the house, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, enveloping me in its suffocating embrace. Strange noises echoed through the empty corridors, the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, as though some unseen presence was watching my every move. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that clung to me like a second skin, but it was as though the very walls of the house were closing in around me, trapping me in a nightmare from which I could not awaken. Part 2. The Unwelcome Embrace. As I ventured further into the dimly lit interior of my grandmother's cottage, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to intensify, weighing down on me like a suffocating blanket. The air was thick with a scent of decay, mingling with a musty odor of neglect that permeated every corner of the house. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that seemed to leer at me with malevolent intent. I wandered through the empty corridors, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet with each hesitant step. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves outside and the faint sound of my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. The familiar sights and sounds of my grandmother's home had been replaced by a sense of desolation and abandonment that sent shivers down my spine. As I reached the heart of the house, a sense of dread washed over me like a tidal wave, threatening to engulf me in its icy grip. The room before me was cloaked in darkness, the only illumination coming from the feeble light of a single candle, flickering on a dusty table in the corner. Shadows danced and swirled around the room, casting eerie shapes upon the walls that seemed to pulse and writhe with a life of their own. With trembling hands, I reached out to grasp the candle, its warm glow offering little solace in the face of the encroaching darkness. As I turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind extinguished the flame, plunging the room into pitch-black darkness. Panic surged through me like a tidal wave, threatening to overwhelm my senses as I groped blindly for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. At last, my fingers found purchase on the cool metal handle, and with a trembling hand, I pushed open the door and stumbled out into the corridor beyond. But as I stepped into the dimly lit hallway, a sense of unease washed over me like a tidal wave, threatening to pull me back into the darkness from which I had just escaped. The walls seemed to close in around me, pressing in on all sides as though eager to swallow me whole. Desperate to escape the suffocating embrace of the house, I hurried down the corridor, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty halls. But no matter how fast I ran, the darkness seemed to pursue me, its tendrils reaching out to ensnare me in its icy grip. I could feel eyes watching me from the shadows, unseen and malevolent, their gaze burning into my soul with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. At last, I reached the front door, my heart pounding in my chest as I fumbled with the lock. With a final, desperate twist, the door swung open, and I stumbled out into the cool night air, gasping for breath as though I had been holding it in for an eternity. But even as I fled into the safety of the night, I could feel the house watching me, its presence looming over me like a dark specter, waiting patiently for my inevitable return. Part 3. The Haunting Memories. As I stood outside the cottage, gasping for breath in the cool night air, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness within still clung to me like a shroud. The memories of my childhood flooded back, each one tinged with a sense of unease that I had long since buried deep within my subconscious. The nights spent in this house had always been filled with laughter and warmth, but now they seemed like distant echoes of a time long past, distorted by the malevolent presence that lurked within these walls. With a shudder, I tore my gaze away from the cottage and turned to face the surrounding forest, its towering trees looming ominously in the moonlight. The branches swayed in the gentle breeze, casting shifting shadows that seemed to dance and twist with a life of their own. The woods had always held a sense of mystery and wonder for me as a child, but now they seemed like a labyrinth of darkness, hiding unseen terrors behind every tree and bush. Despite my growing sense of unease, I felt compelled to explore the woods, as though drawn by some unseen force towards an unknown destination. With hesitant steps, I ventured into the shadows, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. The darkness seemed to swallow me whole as I plunged deeper into the heart of the forest, the trees closing in around me like silent sentinels guarding some ancient secret. As I wandered through the labyrinth of twisted branches and tangled undergrowth, a sense of disorientation washed over me like a wave, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. Shapes and shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, vanishing into the darkness before I could grasp them. The woods seemed to stretch on endlessly in every direction, their secrets hidden behind a veil of darkness that refused to be pierced. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a faint whispering that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the forest itself. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen to the disembodied voices that echoed through the trees. The words were indistinct, whispered on the edge of hearing, but their tone was unmistakably sinister, sending a chill down my spine. With a mounting sense of dread, I turned and fled back the way I had come, my footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. The forest seemed to close in around me, its shadows reaching out to ensnare me in their icy embrace. I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness, unseen and malevolent, their gaze burning into my soul with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. At last, I burst through the tree line and stumbled back into the clearing where the cottage stood, gasping for breath as though I had just escaped from the jaws of some unseen predator. But even as I collapsed onto the ground, I knew that the darkness had not been left behind in the woods. It lingered in the air like a foul stench, tainting everything it touched with its malevolent presence. And as I lay there, trembling and exhausted, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that unseen eyes followed my every move, waiting patiently for the moment when they would strike. Part 4. The Whispering Voices. As I lay in the dimly lit room of my grandmother's cottage, the events of the night replayed in my mind like a twisted nightmare from which I couldn't awaken. The darkness seemed to press in on all sides, suffocating me with its oppressive weight. Outside, the wind howled mournfully through the trees, its eerie wail echoing through the empty corridors of the house. I tried to shake off the sense of unease that gripped me, but it clung to me like a second skin, refusing to be cast aside. The events of the evening had shaken me to my core, leaving me feeling vulnerable and exposed in this unfamiliar place. I longed to flee, to escape the suffocating embrace of the house, but something held me captive, rooted to the spot like a deer caught in the headlights. As I lay there, lost in my thoughts, a faint whispering filled the air, barely audible above the sound of the wind outside. I strained to listen, my heart pounding in my chest as the voices grew louder, their words indistinct, but tinged with a sense of urgency that sent a shiver down my spine. It was as though the very walls of the house were alive with the sound, their secrets spilling forth into the darkness. With a mounting sense of dread, I sat up and listened, my ears straining to catch every word. The voices seemed to be coming from all around me, their words overlapping and intertwining in a cacophony of sound that made my head spin. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their tone was unmistakably sinister, filled with malice and intent. Desperate to escape the torment of the voices, I stumbled to my feet and fled from the room, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced down the corridor. But no matter how fast I ran, the voices pursued me, their whispers growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. It was as though they were inside my head, driving me to the brink of madness with their ceaseless chatter. With a cry of despair, I burst out into the night air, gasping for breath as though I had been held underwater for far too long. But even as I stood there, panting and exhausted, I could still hear the voices echoing in my mind, their sinister whispers following me like a shadow wherever I went. I knew then that I was trapped, ensnared in a web of darkness from which there was no escape. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, a figure emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct and hazy in the dim light of the moon. I tried to speak, to cry out for help, but no sound escaped my lips. The figure drew closer, its movements slow and deliberate, until at last it stood before me, its face hidden in the darkness. With a sudden sense of horror, I realized that the figure was not alone. It was surrounded by a host of otherworldly beings, their forms twisted and distorted beyond recognition. They reached out to me with clawed hands, their eyes burning with an otherworldly light that sent a chill down my spine. In that moment, I knew that I was doomed, that the darkness had claimed me as its own. And as the figures closed in around me, their whispers growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment, I surrendered myself to the darkness, knowing that there was no escape from the horrors that awaited me within. Part 5. The Ghastly Apparition. In the dead of night, as the moon cast its pale glow upon the land, I found myself drawn once more into the depths of my grandmother's cottage. The darkness seemed to cling to me like a shroud as I stepped through the threshold, enveloping me in its suffocating embrace. Shadows danced and swirled around me, their shapes twisting and contorting into grotesque forms that seemed to leer at me with malevolent intent. As I wandered through the empty corridors, a sense of dread washed over me like a tidal wave, threatening to engulf me in its icy grip. I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness, unseen and malevolent, their gaze burning into my soul with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. But still, I pressed on, driven by some unseen force towards an unknown destination. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, a low moan that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the house itself. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest, as the sound grew louder and more insistent. It was as though the very walls of the house were crying out in anguish, their torment echoing through the empty halls. With trembling hands, I pressed forward, guided by the faint glow of a single candle flickering in the distance. As I drew closer, the moaning grew louder, filling the air with a sense of dread that threatened to overwhelm me. And then, as I rounded a corner, I saw it, a ghastly apparition, its form twisted and distorted beyond recognition. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips as the figure drew closer, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light. It reached out to me with clawed hands, its touch sending a shiver down my spine. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to flee from the horror that confronted me. But the apparition was relentless, its form seeming to warp and shift with every step. It pursued me through the empty corridors, its moans echoing in my ears like a dirge for the damned. I could feel its icy breath on my neck, its presence looming over me like a dark specter from a nightmare. At last, with nowhere left to run, I turned and faced the apparition head-on, my heart pounding in my chest as I braced myself for the final confrontation. But as I looked into its hollow eyes, I saw something there, a flicker of recognition, a glimmer of humanity amidst the darkness. And in that moment, I realized that the apparition was not a malevolent force seeking to do me harm, but a lost soul trapped within the confines of the house. With a surge of courage, I reached out to it, offering a hand of friendship in the face of overwhelming darkness. And as our hands touched, the darkness seemed to recede, replaced by a warm glow that filled the room with light. The apparition smiled, its features softening as it faded into the ether, leaving behind a sense of peace that had long been absent from the house. In that moment, I knew that I had conquered the darkness that had plagued my grandmother's cottage for so long. And though the memory of that night would haunt me forever, I took solace in the knowledge that I had faced my fears and emerged victorious in the end. Part 6. The Malevolent Presence. With the ghastly apparition vanquished, a false sense of tranquility settled over my grandmother's cottage. Yet, beneath the surface, a malevolent presence still lurked, its tendrils reaching out from the shadows to ensnare unsuspecting souls. I could feel its icy grip tightening around me with each passing moment, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay just beyond the veil of reality. As I wandered through the empty corridors, the air grew thick with the stench of decay, mingling with the musty odor of neglect that permeated every corner of the house. Shadows danced and swirled around me, their shapes twisting and contorting into grotesque forms that seemed to leer at me with malicious intent. I knew then that I was not alone in the house, that unseen forces watched and waited in the darkness, hungering for something I could not fathom. With each passing moment, the malevolent presence grew stronger, its insidious influence seeping into every corner of my being. I could feel its whispers echoing in the recesses of my mind, urging me towards actions I knew to be wrong. It was as though the very essence of the house had been tainted by some ancient evil, a darkness that hungered for nothing less than my soul. Desperate to escape the suffocating embrace of the house, I fled into the night, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced through the surrounding forest. But no matter how fast I ran, the darkness pursued me, its tendrils reaching out to ensnare me in their icy grip. I could feel its presence looming over me like a dark cloud, threatening to consume me whole. At last, I stumbled upon a clearing bathed in the pale light of the moon, its beauty marred by the overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air. I knew then that I had stumbled upon something ancient and malevolent, a force that had long been forgotten by the world. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I was in the presence of something far more powerful than I could ever hope to comprehend. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, a figure emerged from the shadows, its form indistinct and hazy in the dim light of the moon. It spoke to me in a voice that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the earth, its words filled with ancient wisdom and unfathomable malice. I could feel its eyes boring into my soul, stripping away the layers of my being until there was nothing left but raw terror. With a cry of despair, I fell to my knees, my mind consumed by the darkness that surrounded me. I knew then that I was lost, that there was no escape from the malevolent presence that had taken hold of my soul. And as the shadows closed in around me, I surrendered myself to the darkness, knowing that I would never again see the light of day. Part 7. The Sinister Revelation. As the night wore on, the malevolent presence within my grandmother's cottage seemed to intensify, its dark influence seeping into every corner of the house. I could feel its icy grip tightening around me, suffocating me with its oppressive weight. Shadows danced and swirled around me, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to mock my very existence. It was as though the house itself had come alive with a malevolent energy, thirsting for something beyond my comprehension. With trembling hands, I ventured deeper into the bowels of the house, guided by an unseen force towards a revelation that filled me with dread. As I entered a forgotten chamber hidden deep within the heart of the cottage, I was greeted by a sight that chilled me to the bone. The walls were adorned with strange symbols and sigils, their meaning lost to the sands of time. In the center of the room lay a makeshift altar, its surface stained with blood and ichor. A sense of horror washed over me as I realized the true nature of my grandmother's cottage, a nexus of darkness and despair that had consumed all who dared to tread its halls. I could feel the weight of centuries, old rituals pressing down upon me, their purpose shrouded in darkness and madness. It was then that I understood the true extent of the evil that lurked within these walls, a darkness that had been awakened by my very presence. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, a voice echoed through the empty chamber, its tone filled with malice and intent. I turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows, its form twisted and distorted beyond recognition. It spoke to me in a language that I could not understand, its words reverberating through the room like a death knell. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I was in the presence of something ancient and malevolent, a force that had long been forgotten by the world. It reached out to me with clawed hands, its eyes burning with an otherworldly light. I could feel its presence looming over me like a dark cloud, threatening to consume me whole. With a cry of despair, I fled from the chamber, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced through the empty corridors of the house. But no matter how fast I ran, the darkness pursued me, its tendrils reaching out to ensnare me in their icy grip. I could feel its malevolent gaze burning into my soul, stripping away the layers of my being until there was nothing left but raw terror. At last, I stumbled out into the night air, gasping for breath, as though I had just escaped from the jaws of death itself. But even as I stood there, trembling and exhausted, I knew that the darkness had not been left behind in the house. It lingered in the air like a foul stench, tainting everything it touched with its malevolent presence. And as I gazed up at the stars twinkling in the night sky, I knew that I was not alone in my terror, that the darkness that had consumed my grandmother's cottage would continue to haunt me until the end of days. Part 8. The Final Confrontation. As dawn broke on the horizon, casting its pale light upon the desolate landscape, I knew that the time had come to confront the darkness that had plagued my grandmother's cottage for so long. With a sense of grim determination, I returned to the house, the weight of impending doom heavy upon my shoulders. The air was thick with an oppressive stillness, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a lone bird. As I crossed the threshold once more, the darkness seemed to press in around me, suffocating me with its malevolent presence. Shadows danced and swirled around the empty corridors, their shapes twisting into grotesque forms that seemed to mock my very existence. But I refused to be cowed by fear, drawing upon a reserve of courage I never knew I possessed. With each step I took, the darkness seemed to recede, driven back by the light of my resolve. I could feel its malevolent gaze burning into my soul, but I stood firm, unyielding in the face of its onslaught. As I entered the heart of the house, I felt a sense of calm wash over me, a feeling of clarity amidst the chaos. In the center of the chamber, I found the source of the darkness, a pulsating mass of writhing tendrils, its form shifting and changing with each passing moment. I knew then that this was the true embodiment of the malevolent force that had plagued my grandmother's cottage for generations, a creature of darkness and despair that thrived on the suffering of others. With a steady hand, I reached out to confront the creature, my heart pounding in my chest as I prepared for the final battle. The creature recoiled at my touch, its form writhing in agony as though unable to withstand the purity of my resolve. I could feel its malevolent presence waning, driven back by the light of my courage. But even as the creature faltered, I knew that the battle was far from over. With a deafening roar, it lashed out at me with all its fury, its tendrils striking like serpents poised to strike. I fought back with all my strength, driving the creature back with each blow. It was a battle of wills, a struggle for dominance between light and darkness. At last, with a final, desperate cry, I delivered the decisive blow, striking the creature down with all my might. With a deafening roar, it vanished into the ether, its malevolent presence dispersing like morning mist in the light of dawn. I stood there, panting and exhausted, but victorious in the face of overwhelming darkness. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, casting their warm glow upon the desolate landscape, I knew that the darkness that had plagued my grandmother's cottage for so long had finally been vanquished. And as I stepped out into the dawn, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, knowing that I had confronted my fears and emerged victorious in the end.